All right. Let's see, exams, they're graded, grades are posted. I'll get back Tuesday. We'll go over my son. You know, makeups yet. It's all Olivia's fault. But they're up there. They weren't bad. The average was 70, which is okay. There were a couple of A's. There were a few that were a little low, but remember, it's early yet. This is like the first test. So lab practical coming up in a couple of weeks. And then 4 weeks after that, have another exam. So it's only one. And I don't think anyone dug themselves a huge, insurmountable hole. There were a few in the 50s who didn't grade, but recoverable. Let's see. So we were looking at the heart a little bit last time. Let me get my little heart back up here. This is the right side of the heart. All right, so I think where we had quit, we're looking at blood flow through the heart. It's just kind of naming the parts and a little bit of what they do. So the blood, we're looking at the right side of the heart. Remember, it's two pumps. You got a right heart, the left heart. They tend to develop in the same area, but you could have the different spots mechanically. It is really two pumps. So the blood comes in passively. So you have 80% filling of the ventricles during diastole. So there's a low blood pressure in the vena cava. I mean, obviously, they're only, a couple of millimeters of mercury, but it's higher than in the heart. So again, the blood will flow and it'll fill up the atrium, a little small sort of bag-like chamber on top of the heart. Then it flows into the ventricle, and you fill up the ventricle passively to about 80% of its capacity. So when you talk about diastole, again, what's important kind of know with diastole is it's easy to ignore because the heart's not doing anything. This is the filling phase, so it's important during diastole. Yeah, the heart's not doing anything, but that's when the blood is filling up these chambers. So passively fills to 80%, nothing's happening. Then the heart will enter a systole, and the last 20% of the blood enters the ventricle during atrial systole. Again, you can separate the systole and diastole. In general, if you just say systole, it means heart contraction, diastole, relaxation. But because the chambers, the atrium and ventricle, they don't contract exactly at the same time, you may separate it. So you might see discussions of atrial systole and diastole and ventricular systole and diastole. They're not quite at the same moment. So again, if you're watching a heart contract, the impulse and the contraction initiates in the atria. So the atria contract first. And again, the atria are very small chambers, very thin wall. All they do is squeeze that blood a little bit, up the pressure a little bit, and they squeeze that last 20% into the ventricles. And that's one of the main functions of the atria. Again, they do two things. They're sort of what's called top-off or sort of priming pumps. They squeeze that last 20% into the ventricles. They also, in a moment, the ventricles will contract. When they do, no more blood goes into the ventricles, but the blood that's coming from the vena cava will continue to pour into the atria and kind of fill it up. Kind of acts as a storage area when the ventricle isn't accepting blood. All right, so ventricle, atria contracts, fills up the ventricle. Then I think we mentioned, the valves. Valve action is completely passive. So when the ventricle contracts, the blood tries to backflow from the ventricle to the atria. But again, this is what the valves are for. You have a series of one-way valves in the circulatory system formed in the heart. And they only allow blood to move one direction. If it starts to go the other direction, the valve will close. So when blood tries to push back into the right atria, that's when this is a tricuspid or the right AV valve will slam shut. And I mentioned that's the first heart sound you hear, the love dub, is the AV valve shutting. When they shut, they vibrate the tissue a little bit, you can hear that. Then the pressure will build up, and eventually, then the blood will exit out a second opening into the ventricles, which goes into the pulmonary trunk on the right side. Now, here's where 20/5. If that is your blood pressure, how you doing? You're actually fine. Again, when we look at blood pressure clinically, we always look at blood pressure in the brachial artery, and it's 120/80. This does not go to the brachial artery. This is the pulmonary trunk. That is actually the normal blood pressure in your pulmonary trunk. It's about 20/5. It's much lower than it is on the other side of the heart. So keep that in mind. Blood pressure, again, depending on where you measure, can be different. Now, generally, you don't measure pulmonary, this blood pressure in the pulmonary trunk much. Why? Because how would you measure it? You have to open the chest to get it. It's not convenient. We don't measure. And honestly, it's not usually that important clinically. Or the other arteries, as we'll see, it'll be more important. But that is actually normal pressure. So you got to be a little careful. Pressure in the aorta is going to be different than pressure in the pulmonary trunk. Pressure in the pulmonary trunk is, 1/6 of what it is in the aorta. But notice the top number is systolic pressure. That's when the ventricles contract and ejecting the blood. That 5 is the diastolic pressure when the right ventricle is relaxed. So when the ventricle is contracting, when it's in systole, it is going to be ejecting blood out. But of course, the ventricle is not going to be in systole forever, right? It's only a few tenths of a second. Then that ventricle will go back into diastole. When this ventricle goes into diastole, the blood pressure basically drops to 0. So again, now the problem is your blood pressure in the pulmonary trunk is never 0. It's 20/5, at least not while you're alive. So this blood that's been ejected in the pulmonary trunk, it's going to go backwards. I mean, if the pressure is, say, 5 millimeters of mercury here, 0 here, it's going to try to go backwards, right? Again, you can't let the blood go from the pulmonary trunk back into the ventricles, and out and back. It would just oscillate. So, of course, there's another valve here. And that one is called the pulmonary valve. This is a pulmonary semilunar valve. They're not as elaborate looking as the AV valves. There's little bag-like membranes at the end of cardiac wheels, connected tissue up here, small. But they allow the blood to leave. If it goes backwards and tries to backflow into the ventricle, they'll shut. This is the second heart sound, the dub and the love dub. So you got close, close, love dub. Those are the sounds you hear. Now, a couple other things with these valves, because we look at them live, we'll get some here again. Only the AV valves, that is the valves from the atrium and ventricle, they're fairly big in diameter because that's a pretty big opening because you got pretty low pressure blood, so you need a big opening to allow it to flow in easily. And if you look at a fresh heart valve, the ones in those preserved hearts, they've gotten kind of hardened by the formaldehyde. They're almost paper thin. I mean, if you grab just a cusp of an AV valve, the bicuspid or tricuspid, it's like a little thin piece of, cellophane or something. You're going to generate some substantial pressures in here. This valve is so big and so thin, it's going to have a tendency to push back into the atria. If you push back too much, it's kind of like an umbrella in the wind. It'll blow inside out, which would be bad for the flow to backflow. So on the AV valves in mammalian hearts, you have these they're like little guy wires. Those are the chordae tendineae for lab. They go from little projections of the ventricular muscle, little bumps, they call them papillary muscles. That's where one end of the cord is connected. The other end, they attach to the cuff. So when the heart contracts, these tend to prevent it from moving, getting pushed into the atria too much. Now, if you ever hear the term prolapse with valves, this is what the prolapse is. Notice that, they're pretty thin, they're pretty wide. If you get pressure in here, that valve's a little elastic. It's going to push back in the atria bit, where that dotted line is. That's prolapse. There is some normal amount of prolapse in the valves. When it gets to be, a clinical significance, it pushes back too much, then then it can cause some problems. We all get a little bit of that stretch back in the atria. All right, let's see. So those are the valves. A couple other things. So I didn't take allergy pill the last week or so. I should have. I ran out. That was right on. All right. One more thing with the valves. Yeah, these valves normally make a nice watertight seal when they close. Occasionally they don't. If you get like an infection, strep or something, it can move down and it tends to, affect the heart valves. The dentist, you ever gone to get dental work done and they'll ask you if you are on antibiotics or have any infections? That's why they start drilling. Infections from up here can drop down to the heart bit. And if you get a little infection here, it might be referred to as endocarditis because it inflames the endocardium, which covers these valves. But you can get some damage done, some scar tissue, let's say, which means this valve will leak. You can also get, congenital, defects in development where the cusps don't quite line up right. When that happens, let's say this ventricle contracts, the valve shuts, but if there's a hole in it, that blood is going to squirt through this hole at pretty high velocity, and it squirts that hole in a turbulent manner. It vibrates the tissue, you can hear it. Of course, they call these things, that's what a heart murmur is. With some practice, you can detect them. I've listened to a few, I can barely tell what's going on. But, you might hear that kind of love, love, dub. If you hear love, dub, you hear a little swishing sound. It's that blood squirting through here, you can hear it. They call it a heart murmur. This just means you have a bit of a leak in a valve. Now, sometimes, young kids will have them, the valves aren't quite the right size yet. They grow out of it later. But it is a bit of a leak. And what's kind of interesting, if you have a leaky valve, you need to fix it.
All depends.
It depends. All right. Again, here's what happens. If blood is moving backwards through this hole, can your heart compensate by pumping more blood forward? Yes. Remember, you have like an 8-fold amount of cardiac reserve. You're pumping 5 liters per minute. You can pump up to 40. So a few mLs leaking backwards, not a big deal. You'll certainly be able to compensate and keep the right amount of blood flowing. That's not a big deal. So, not a big deal. But what if this hole gets bigger and bigger and bigger? You're getting a pretty bad leak now. Do you have to fix it? Because again, hey, we can now fix it. Well, isn't that like getting a valve job done in your car? I think they still cut your sternum, pry the rib cage open. It's open heart surgery. Well, it's pretty routine now, easily done. You just don't want to randomly do that, because there's some risk involved and there's some recovery time, and I'm sure it's not pleasant. So how do you know if you need to fix this leaky valve? It's leaking. Is it leaking bad enough? You know what they look for? Ventricular hypertrophy. All right, when something hypertrophy, it just needs to get bigger. So if you think about it, if there's blood leaking backwards, in order to keep the blood flowing, the ventricle's going to have to work harder, right? Well, if you exercise a muscle more, guess what it does? It gets bigger. So you might think, well, this is great. This big hunking heart and pumping more blood. To a degree, that's true. Like athletes typically have a little bit more massive heart. More muscle, you can pump more. But there's a bit of a problem. So let me draw a ventricle over here. Here's one ventricle. All right. Now, we know in this ventricle, there's a chamber here that has blood in it, that has oxygen in it. Can that oxygen supply all these ventricular muscle cells? No. We know then what happens is it's too thick. Diffusion is not going to move oxygen to, an inch-thick layer of ventricular muscle. So we have the coronary arteries and veins, right? So coming out here somewhere, you have a bunch of coronary arteries coming down and excuse me, spreading through here, and you've got coronary veins bringing the blood back, and so forth. Because again, cardiac muscle cells have to have a good oxygen supply, blood supply, or they just die. No anaerobic metabolism. The problem is, as you start to get a bigger ventricle, to a degree that's good, but eventually what happens is your ventricle, as it gets bigger, its volume can increase so quickly that basically the blood supply can't keep up. So you're gonna get these really big ventricles, but the blood supply isn't growing fast enough. The blood vessels aren't thick enough to supply all the cells with oxygen. If you get to that point, you have these big chambers that aren't getting enough oxygen. They'll actually start to die, and you'll end up with these really big chambers that are really thin-walled. That tends to work really poorly as a pump. Again, it's because of death of some cardiac muscle cells. So what they do to see if you need to replace your valves or not. They look at the size of the heart. If they notice that the ventricles are getting bigger, then it's time to replace that valve. If they don't notice ventricular hypertrophy, we'll just skip it for now. And they can see ventricular hypertrophy with EKGs. I think after the exam, I'll hook somebody up EKGs, we'll just play around with a little bit. X-rays, ultrasound, so you can detect it fairly easily. So let's say you got some leaky valves. And they're starting to note some ventricular hypertrophy. So they have to go and replace the valve. The valve replacement, again, it's fairly routine anymore, but you have a couple options. They will often give you cadaver valves. They will take valves off somebody's dead heart. It's not like transplanting a heart. Of course, cardiac muscle cells, we need to transplant a heart. That has to come out of the recipient, come out of the donor, put on ice, and take them to the recipient immediately with tons of the effervescence. You have a few hours and the heart's dead. Valves are not like that. Valves are connective tissue epithelium. You can throw them on ice, and I don't know how long they keep, but it's not an emergency. I've seen people at the ticket line at the airport with boxes of valves for transplant. They're not in a big hurry to get them anywhere. The whole heart, they have to get there much quicker. So you can use cadaver hearts. They'll use valves out of a human heart. They occasionally use pig valves. Pig hearts are close to our size. If it's the same size valve, it will transplant. There are advantages to using the cadaver valves. Let's say cadaver valves, but the tissue is alive. The organism is dead, but not the valves. One, because it is a living tissue, it's self-repairing. So once you put that sucker in there, it'll repair any damage, so it should last as long as you do. But what's the downside of using the cadaver valves? You transplant any organ. You just plop a kidney out of somebody, stick it in somebody else, and you're good to go? No, why not? That immune system is a problem. Again, your immune system, the way it works sort of in a nutshell, imagine early development, it takes an inventory of all the proteins in your blood on your cells. So if the protein's on that list, the immune system generally doesn't attack it. If something comes in that's sort of not on the list, your immune system will attack it thinking it's a bacteria or something like that. It doesn't know you need to transplant it, just recognizes it as foreign. And unless the individual you get the valve from is an identical twin, you're going to be genetically a little different, so your immune system will recognize it as foreign and attack it. And so this is true of any time you get a transplanted organ, they have to suppress your immune system a little bit, which isn't great, because of course if you suppress someone's immune system, you're immune compromised now, it makes you more susceptible to other diseases and infections. So that's a problem. The other option, we now make a bunch of synthetic valves. They're made out of nylon, stainless steel, Kevlar. Your immune system only recognizes proteins and glycoproteins. It doesn't respond to stainless steel, nylon, Kevlar, synthetics like that. It doesn't do anything. So you can put in a synthetic valve. So the advantage of a synthetic valve, you don't have to worry about immune response. Any disadvantages? They're mechanical. Like the valves in your car. How long do they last? There's a lifespan. They're not going to self-repair. Now, normally, when you're engineering something like this, like a heart valve for someone, you want to engineer it so it has a lifespan of, 100 years. That way, you put it in someone, they're going to be dead before the valve is supposed to wear out. But because it's a manufactured item, just like in anything else, there can be manufacturing defects. And it would be kind of nasty, but it wasn't that. It was about 25, 30 years ago. They had a bunch of heart valves. It was a type that had like a little disc on a couple pivots, and it just went like this inside the heart. But there was a manufacturing defect, so they had a recall on those valves. Could you imagine how much that would suck? I mean, getting a recall on your car is one thing, but oh crap, one of the pins was breaking off. It was rattling around in there. And yeah, they got to go open your chest again and replace it. Really a pain in the neck. Again, that's unusual, but it is a possibility. They can have defects. Hopefully they have good quality control in manufacturing, things like that. What's the other defect or other problem with synthetic valve? All right. The other problem, probably more important than the manufacturing defects, is the blood. Anytime blood comes in contact with foreign material, that's anything basically with the endothelium covering your blood vessels and the endocardium of your heart, it will cause the blood to clot. It's like, when you give blood, they put it in those little containers. If you just used a plain glass test tube, filled it with blood, about 2 hours later, you could pour it out, there'd be a solid piece of, gelatin sort of in that tube. It doesn't stay liquid. There's a reaction called clotting, which turns it solid. That's what happens when you get a break in your circulatory system, so you don't lose more blood. The problem is with synthetics in here, you have the potential for getting blood clots to form in here, which isn't good. They can go through the coronary arteries, plug them up, you have heart attacks, you travel up to the brain, stroke. So blood clots, in the blood abnormally are bad. So when you get things like this, they have to give you an anticoagulant, something that reduces your blood's ability to clot. And that's a little tricky because, of course, if you're taking anticoagulants, if you do get a break somewhere in the circulatory system, it tends to bleed a lot more. In fact, if you remember, I think it's been about 15 years, think of the Louisville hospital, they were transplanting, I think it was called the AviaCore heart. It was a fully mechanical heart. And they were basically going to use it as a stopgap. If your heart completely failed and there's not a transplant heart available, they could put in this completely mechanical thing, and it would keep you going until they found a transplant available. And I think in that study, they had some success with it. Some of the patients did fine, they held them on for a while, and then they could get a donor heart. But some of them just died, and if you look at the reason why they died, it was internal bleeding. Because again, with a full mechanical heart, you got the problem with clots, so they would give them anticoagulants. You need to give enough so that the blood doesn't clot in that heart, but if you give too much, you're always getting breaks in your circulatory system. They were bleeding the abdomen and places like that. So it's a little tricky. So that's the downside of the synthetic valves. Hopefully the originals keep working. They don't have to worry about it. All right, let's see. So that's kind of it, all right? Blood goes through, fills the pancreas into the ventricles, passes to 80%. Atria contract, fills up to 100%. When the ventricles contract, AV valves close, semilunar valves will open, blood is ejected. When the ventricles contract diastole, pressure in the ventricle drops, semilunar valve shut. We're done. But here's my next question to you. Why do we have two pumps? One will pump the blood. Why do we have two? Is it just a backup redundancy? Why do you need two? Here, let me stick up a diagram. You don't need to really know the details of the diagram because it's a fish, but what you're seeing here is very diagrammatic. This is you, this is the mammal. There's your left and right ventricle, left and right atria. This is showing you a fish. And what you want to look at, they have one atria, one ventricle. That's like half our heart. Now, if you look at the way the blood goes, so this heart, blood goes into the atria, there's valves in here, they're not drawing them into the ventricle. Ventricle pumps it out, the blood goes out the aorta, and now these big things here are representing capillary beds. Again, you have to push blood through these really small blood vessels, or capillaries, in order for things to diffuse in and out of the blood. So while blood's moving through the big tubes, it actually doesn't do anything. They're kind of like plumbing. You move the blood to these capillary beds of very small blood vessels that are really thin, and that's where diffusion can occur. So if you look at the fish heart, I won't do that now. Sorry. So the heart pumps the blood up the aorta, and then it goes into this thing here. Now this is a respiratory structure. Yeah, it's a gill in a fish, and it's a lung in a human, but from the circulatory system's perspective, the same thing. A respiratory structure has a lot of surface area with, some kind of media on one side, air, water, with oxygenated blood on the other. So they're not different really fundamentally as far as the circulatory system is concerned. So the fish pushes the blood through the respiratory structure where oxygen diffuses into the blood. Then it takes that oxygenated blood, sends it up to the brain, down to all the muscles, and it comes back to the heart. Works just fine. So what a fish has, one atria, one ventricle, pumps the blood, fish seem to do just fine. So why do we have two pumps? I mean, basically we have two of these. Atrioventricle, atrioventricle. Why do we have two pumps in a human? Any ideas, speculation?
We require more oxygen.
That's the big one. All right. One of the main differences between a fish and a mammal is metabolic rate. Now fish aren't any slouches. Some can swim 60 miles an hour, but what fish are not is endothermic. Being warm-blooded takes a huge amount of oxygen to maintain that energy output, to maintain body temperature. So both mammals and birds have the same setup with the circulatory system. They're the only ones, really. The few funny reptiles in there. But birds and mammals both have a four-chambered heart. All the fish, most of the vertebrates do not. And yet, it's metabolism. They have a much higher demand for oxygen. Well, how does this help with the demand for oxygen? All right. What we're interested in is Now, when you look at the circulatory systems kind of general, you're pushing fluid through tubes, right? This little equation here kind of describes what factors affect pushing blood or fluid through a tube. This doesn't matter if it's a piece of PVC pipe, air duct in your house, or a blood vessel. The rules are all the same. So flow through a particular tube, maybe in milliliters per minute, is determined by two things. This delta P, that's the pressure, or the pressure difference across the tube. If you have P1 here, P2 here. As I mentioned earlier, you have to have a pressure difference for fluid to flow, right? The pressure is the same through the whole tube, it doesn't move. So if I measure the pressure at the beginning of the tube and the pressure at the end, the difference in pressure, that's what this delta P is. In a human, if you look at the entire circulatory system, the difference in pressure is the pressure in your aorta versus the pressure in the vena cava. It's that 120/8. It's your whole systemic blood pressure. So this number is really, if it helps you, since we're not really going to stick numbers in here at the moment, this is just your blood pressure. You can look at it the whole system, or you can look at it a section of pipe at a time. You just look at the pressure difference across whatever tube you're looking at. Again, all else being equal, higher pressure, higher flow. Now, the one we'll look at here, what is R? R is probably the trickiest of those three things. R is usually not measured. It's kind of tricky to measure. R is resistance. You can measure flow. You have a pipe, just hold a bucket over it, measure how much water flows out of it. That's your flow. Pressure, we have all kinds of easy pressure measuring devices. The R is a little different. R is resistance, and it's affected by a bunch of things. But when you're looking at the circulatory system, you gotta kind of keep it in mind. Resistance is basically how hard is it to push fluid through the tube. It's affected by many things, like the wall of the tube. How rough is it? How smooth is it? It's harder to push fluid through a rough tube than a really smooth tube. That's why your blood vessels are lined with that, layer of epithelium makes it nice and smooth, so it's your heart. Also, the length of the tube. I mean, if you had a straw about this long, you stick it in your coffee, pretty easy to drink. If you took the same size straw, but you make it, 12 feet long, is it just as easy to suck fluid through a 12-foot straw as a 1-foot straw? No. Why? There's friction. The fluid runs scraping across the inside of the tube. Admittedly, it's not a lot of friction, but there is friction. So the longer you have to pull it through a tube, the harder it is to do. So the longer a tube, that's going to increase resistance a little bit. The material that you're trying to push through the tube, like water. You ever take a straw, drink water, soda, coffee, pretty easy, right? You ever taken a straw and stick it in, Karo syrup or something and try to suck it through the straw? Think it works very well? No. Viscosity, how thick the fluid is, really thick fluid, it's hard to push through tubes. So a lot of things affect how hard it is to push fluid through a tube or a series of tubes. But the biggest one that we'll keep track of is diameter of the tube. It has a huge impact on resistance. And the reason this one's going to be really important to us, blood vessels, remember I said they're not quite like PVC pipe. They have smooth muscle in them. That means blood vessels can constrict, they can dilate, they get small or big. That has a huge impact on resistance, which can have a huge impact on flow through that particular tube. Let me give you one example, because it's kind of interesting. Let's see. If I take a tube, all right, I've just got a piece of pipe. It's this long. I've got a pressure gradient of, 100 millimeters of mercury. And the diameter is 1. It's unitless, 1 unit, doesn't matter what it is. And now imagine I'm going to take a little container, and I'm going to put it here, and I want to measure how much fluid, flows out of that pipe in a minute. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's 1 milliliter per minute. All right, so that's sort of our starting point. We've got this tube, it's this big, 1 unit diameter, it's got this pressure, it has a flow rate of 1 milliliter per minute. Now all I'm going to do, I'm going to change the pipe a little bit. I'm going to make it bigger. This pipe is now twice the diameter. It's still the same pressure, delta P equals 100 millimeters of mercury. It's still the same length, it's still the same fluid. I put my container up here, and now I want to see how much fluid pours out of this thing in a minute. And what I'll find is I get 16 milliliters per minute. And let me do one more just so you can see the pattern. I take another tube, I double it again. Now I got a tube with a diameter of 4. Same pressure, same length, same fluid, everything else. I take my container, I let the fluid pour out, and I get give me a second here. I get 256 milliliters per minute. This is a huge impact I'm trying to show. It's an exponential effect. Like the length, if you double the length of the tube, it doubles the resistance. If you change the diameter, say make it twice as big, you don't have half the resistance. It's an exponential effect. In fact, the way I got these numbers, take the diameter, raise it to the 4th power. 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, I can do that in my head. That's 1. Diameter 2, everything else is the same, so 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. And this one's 4, so 4 to the 4th power, I did my math right, it's 256. Diameter has a huge impact on flow through the tube, and it'll have a huge impact on pressure. So, let me go over here, tell you what the problem is with the fish, and why we don't have the fish set up, why it won't work. All right, let's see. We'll go out in the backyard on a better day than today. Here's our spigot. And I attach a garden hose to this thing. Now, have you ever been out in the yard, when you're little, and you're out there playing with the neighbor kids, your siblings, and it's usually the older brother takes a hose, kinks it in half, and he waits till one of the kids looks at it and, he can spray it in the face, that sort of thing. All right, that's what we're gonna do. So we got this, it's just faucet coming out of your house. A lot of pressure in here, water's flowing out. Then somebody takes this hose and they kink it. They bend it in half. Of course, what happens to the flow through that hose when you kink it? It drops tremendously, right? Now, if you had to guess, if I measured the pressure here, I'm going to call it P1, before the kink, and I measure the pressure here after the kink, where's the pressure higher, P1 or P2? P1? Yeah. That kink is basically an area of a lot of resistance. So the pressure is going to be really high here, but when you go through one of these areas of high resistance, the flow drops so much, the pressure drops tremendously. So there's really low pressure here. Garden hose, that kind of makes sense? All right, that's what we have here. See what's happening, as the blood leaves the fish heart, it's under pretty high pressure, but these really small blood vessels, these capillaries and the small blood vessels leading to them, they're like that. They're a kink in the hose. It's almost the way it has to be made. If you have a heart, I'll draw a heart here. You got the arteries coming out, and as you notice in the calves, you follow those arteries out to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually these arteries will run into really tiny arteries called arterioles that are really small in diameter, and then they branch into the capillary beds. I'll do this for a capillary bed. They go through the tissues, they come back together, and then they go back to the heart. This area right here, right about when you get to the capillary beds, that's just like a kink in the hose. That's an area of really high resistance. So the pressure is high here. It's like where you measure your brachial artery. Once you pass through the capillary beds in the veins, that's why the pressure is so low in the vein. So this is what happens in a fish. You take your blood under high pressure. You run it through the capillaries in the respiratory structure. It's fine, it picks up oxygen. The problem is because of the small diameter of all those blood vessels, the really high resistance, the blood pressure at this point now is really, really low. It's like after the kink in a hose. Well, if pressure is low, if this number here gets really low, what's that going to do to the flow rate of the blood? It's also got to be low, right? Just mathematically, make this number really small, I'm going to get really small. That's what happens. You run this blood through this capillary network because of the high resistance, which is inherent in a capillary network. The pressure drops tremendously. If you have really low pressure, how fast is this blood going to be going to the rest of the body? Not very fast. It'll meander its way down here, through these capillary beds, gives some oxygen to the tissue, meanders way up here, gives some oxygen to the brain, and then slowly come back. This is too slow a flow rate. It works fine for a fish, they don't have our metabolism. But this system would not get oxygen to your tissues fast enough to maintain, your endothermic characteristics. So what do we do instead? We have an accessory pump. Let's go back to my there's one here. So we do kind of the same thing. The right side of the heart, right ventricle, pumps the blood out from the pulmonary trunk. But where does the pulmonary trunk go? Only one place, really. You follow the pulmonary trunk out, just after it leaves heart, splits into right and left pulmonary arteries. They go to the lungs, which then bring the blood back in the pulmonary veins, and that blood gets oxygenated. It's deoxygenated going into the lungs. That's the arteries, by the way. Oxygenated coming out, that's the veins, the red. But that's going to be really low pressure blood, a couple millimeters of mercury maybe. It flows through the pulmonary veins, it's not moving fast enough. You try to now, like a fish, pump it to the rest of your body, flow rate's going to be too slow. So what do we do with it instead? Where do these pulmonary veins go? They lead into the left atrium. And then the left atrium will send that blood down to the left ventricle, which repressurizes the blood. Now, the blood leaving the left ventricle, where does it go? Sort of in general. It goes everywhere except the lungs, right? Now you follow the aorta out, that's what this would be. It goes, up to the head, through the brachiocephalic, subclavian, the abdominal aorta, all the abdominal cavity and legs. So this is the aorta, which goes to all parts of the body except and that's not there. I won't draw it in. All tissues except the lungs. So what we do is we pump the blood twice to get it through our circulatory system. We pump it once with the right ventricle, pressurize it, send it to the lungs, pick up oxygen, but now the pressure drops. Flow rate is too slow. So we bring it back to the heart, pressurize it again with the left side of the heart, and pump it out to all the tissues very rapidly under high pressure. So you can deliver that oxygen and then pump it again. So it goes through twice. If you watch one blood cell, it goes to the right ventricle, lungs, and then the left ventricle, and out to the rest of the body, back to the right side of the heart. That's why we have two. It's mainly to boost the pressure and flow to maintain a high metabolism. Now, of course, they have names for this. The part of the circulatory system that supplies the lungs, we refer to that as the pulmonary circuit. By convention, the pulmonary circuit starts at the main pump, which is a ventricle. These are circuits. In theory, you can start anywhere. But by convention, we start at the main pump and we end at the opposite atria. So the pulmonary circuit by convention, we start at the ventricle. So you start at the right ventricle, through the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, to the capillaries of the lung, then back in the pulmonary veins, and you end at the left atrium. That's the right side of the heart. The other part is referred to as the systemic circuit. Again, by convention, we start at the left ventricle and go to the opposite atria, the right atria, and that is the systemic circuit. Left ventricle, out the aorta, to all parts of the body except the lungs, and back to the right atrium. So those are our two pulmonary systemic circuits. We have the two pumps, again, mainly to keep the pressure and the flow high enough to support a high metabolism. Like I said, the only other warm blood mammals do exactly the same thing. Birds have a similar setup. They have two hearts, pulmonary systemic circuit, and so forth. So that's why we got two. Let's keep those flows and pressures high. This is also why, I think I mentioned it loud. When you look at the models, you have blue blood vessels and red. What does the blue and red mean? Oxygenated and less oxygenated, or deoxygenated. It doesn't mean artery and vein because in the entire pulmonary circuit, this blood in the right ventricle is deoxygenated. Every artery in the pulmonary circuit is carrying deoxygenated blood. They'll be shaded blue. Once you pass through the lungs and pick up the oxygen, we start shading the blood red. But all the pulmonary veins in the pulmonary circuit are shaded red, even though they're veins. Now the reason, you get that misconception of red is artery, blue is vein, most of the arteries and veins you see are the systemic circuit. And sure, the systemic circuit, the right ventricle has oxygenated blood, so all of the systemic arteries and the systemic veins are all carrying deoxygenated blood and be blue. But be careful, the pulmonary circuit, the color scheme is completely the opposite as far as arteries and veins are concerned. All right, that's pretty decent. Makes some sense. I mean, even if the drawing's terrible, I like doing it like this because mechanically it doesn't matter where the pumps would be. Of course, developmentally, ours are right next to each other, so my drawing's kind of stupid looking from that perspective. I will tell you though, you don't need to know this, there are some fish that do this. They have to have their one pump. There are a few active ones that have a second heart way down in their tail to do the same thing, boost that blood pressure and flow if they're a fairly active fish. All right, so my next question is, you have seen the right ventricle in lab, correct? Hopefully by this point. And you've seen the left ventricle. So, which one do you think pumps more blood? It's a trick question, but which one do you think pumps more blood? Just looking at him, what would you guess? I would guess left. Look at him. You got a pump this big with 1.5 inch thick walls. And you get some wimpy ones like 1/2 inch thick walls. You'd say the left's got to pump more, right? It can't. It doesn't. But why is it so much bigger is kind of weird. Now, why can't they pump different amounts of blood? It turns out this is kind of a neat characteristic of the heart. Your ventricles, both the left and the right, are pumping, on average, exactly the same amount of blood, unless you have congestive heart failure. And that's what congestive heart failure is, when the two ventricles are not pumping the same amount of blood. Here's why. Let's imagine for a second. Here's your left ventricle. It may be smaller in my picture, and in lab it's much bigger. And let's say this thing, let me get some of this junk out of here. Let's say the left ventricle here, it's the big one, is pumping 5 liters per minute. So it comes up here, comes through here, ends up here. Now let's say the right ventricle, being much wimpier, is only pumping 4 liters per minute. Why will this be a problem? Because in a minute, you pump 5 liters of blood here, and you only pump 4 liters of blood away. So how much is left here? A liter. Then the next minute, guess what you have? Another liter, and another liter, and another. The blood would dam up behind the lower pumping ventricle, it would start accumulating in the tissues, and you'd get edemas, and it would kill you. Or you get all this swelling. If this side backs up, you get systemic edemas, you'd swell up like a fluid, all the liquid starts leaking out of your blood vessels, you'd swell up. Or if it's the other way around, if the right was pumping more, your lung would swell up. You get pulmonary edema. So this can't happen. If the heart's working normally, it won't. But here's what's kind of weird. How can they pump? I mean, they're separate pumps with somewhat isolated plumbing. How can they pump exactly the same amount every time? I'm going to put a couple things up here. We kind of know it already. I'm going to give you names that we haven't looked at. There is something called Starling's Law of the Heart. That's what they'll call it in the book. Starling was a physiologist. It's not named after a bird. But that's somebody's name. But what it relates to is, you remember, was it last time, we looked at the length-tension relationship for, skeletal and cardiac muscle when I was talking about the pericardium and such. We looked at something like this. Now in the heart, when we're looking at length, it's really circumference, or another way to think of length is Again, you're looking at overlap of the muscle fibers. If you squeeze more blood into a ventricle, you'll stretch it out more, right? You'll stretch the muscle fibers. So that length, think of it as filling. And over here is the tension or force of contraction. And I gave you a curve, looks something like this. And then we stop here to the pericardium, right? Same leg tension curve you have for skeletal muscle will occur in cardiac muscle to the maximum of the prime pericardium will allow. But what this is saying, if I don't stretch the ventricle out much, which means I don't fill it much, it's not going to generate much tension, right? Not much force. If I squeeze some more blood in there, now when the heart contracts, it contracts with more force. It's actually going to inject more blood. If I fill it up even more, guess what happens? Even more force. This is an intrinsic sort of mechanical characteristic of the heart. What Starling's law means, I mean, there's a big description in the book, but here's what I think of it. If you put more blood into a ventricle, when it contracts, it's going to contract with more force and pump more out automatically. More input, more output within the limits of what the heart can do. Now, the actual description for Starling's law of the heart would be something like, the greater the stretch of the myocardial fibers, the greater the force of contraction. But that's what this means. If you fill it up more, it ejects more. That's what keeps these things in basically perfect balance. If the left ventricle starts pumping more blood, where does it end up? In the right ventricle, and it stretches it out, so the right ventricle pumps more blood. If the left ventricle pumps less blood, less goes into the right, it pumps less. It's a way to automatically control the heart's output based on what goes in. This is basically, it affects stroke volume, that part of the cardiac output. So more blood goes in, that ventricle's going to pump more blood. And as long as both ventricles are functioning normally, they're going to pump the same amount of blood. Now, then why is the left ventricle bigger? They're pumping exactly the same volume of blood. They both pump 5 liters per minute. In fact, that number I gave you for cardiac output, 5 liters per minute, the way that's defined is that's the amount of blood pumped by one ventricle in 1 minute. In reality, if you want to look at it another way, your heart's really pumping 10 liters per minute, 5 from each ventricle. But why is the left bigger? You've seen it in lab, it obviously is, but they're both pumping the same amount of blood. So why is the left side bigger? Yeah, think about it this way. What is the pressure in the pulmonary trunk? I think I gave you something like 20/5, right? What's the pressure in the aorta? 120/80. There's 6 times more pressure in the aorta than the pulmonary trunk. Why? They both have to pump the same amount of blood, but think of where the left ventricle is pumping it, all the way up your head, all the way down to your toes. The resistance is much higher in the systemic circuit. So if you have more resistance, in order to keep the flow up, you must have much higher pressures. Resistance through the pulmonary circuit, think of them as being really big blood vessels and lots of them. There's not much resistance, so fairly low pressures move the same amount of blood. So the ventricle, the left ventricle, is bigger simply because it has to pump blood with about 6 times the pressure. They both pump exactly the same amount of blood. Which means also, if you know somebody has a problem with their heart, guess which side it is. You don't know anything else about them. They just come in, hey, I got, my heart's going bad. Which side is it, left or right? It's almost always the left. Now, that's not to say the right side of the heart can't go bad. It does. But most of the time, if you have cardiovascular problems, it's the left side of the heart. Why? Because it's under a lot more stress. It's left valves that fail. It's left chambers that fail. It's usually the left side because much more stress. That's why when you actually get congestive heart failure, that's usually due to accumulating damage in the heart. What happens in congestive heart failure? This starts to break down. One side of the heart gets weak enough, it doesn't matter if more blood goes in, it's topped up or it's pumping maximally. More blood comes in, it just can't pump it. It's usually this side that goes bad. So what happens is the right ventricle pumps more, the left ventricle can no longer keep up and pumps less, and the blood starts to dam up in the pulmonary circuit. That's why one of the symptoms of congestive heart failure normally is you get fluid buildup in the lungs, coughing up mucus and foamy stuff. But that's why it's usually the left side of the heart that fails. It doesn't have to be. You can get right heart failure for sure. but the left's under a lot more stress. It's typically the one to go.
That's my uncle, he had his aorta. It was just recently.
Yeah,
He
what?
had a problem with his aorta.
Yeah, the pressure. Who was that TV guy? He was on Three's Company. He was kind of big and he ordered rupture. Yeah, they're well, might be a little too old for you guys. But Ritter.
I was thinking Doug Ritter. He drafted with him like, Sean.
But you know about Full House.
Well, no, now it's his son. Everybody knows his son now.
Oh,
His
but
son's in-
I don't know any of them, but yeah, who remembers him? He has a son.
Yeah, it looks just like him.
Oh, okay. But anyway, yeah, it's usually the left side. It doesn't have to be. You can have problems with the right side, but it's usually the left because it's under a lot more stress. All right, let's see. What do I do next? All right, I already did this, right? So cardiac output, that's the amount of blood pumped by the heart, in a minute. And by definition, it's the amount pumped by one vessel in 1 minute. So we have heart rate, that's one component. That will affect cardiac output. And I gave you some average value of something like 70 beats per minute. And then I gave you stroke volume. The way you describe stroke volume, that's basically the amount of blood ejected with each beat, right? I gave you something like 70 milliliters per beat. I want to expand stroke volume a little bit because there are two components to it that we'll eventually need. So stroke volume, this thing, can be expanded a little bit to let me define these abbreviations. EDV is an abbreviation that's commonly used. It means end, kind of descriptive, diastolic volume. What is end diastolic volume? The name actually tells you. What's dialysis? What's diastole? Not dialysis. What's diastole? Rest, right? So what this is saying is, what is the volume of the ventricle at the end of diastole? This means just before the heart contracts, if you measure the ventricle, how much blood is in it? So this is basically the volume in the ventricle before it contracts. Let's say it's something like 140 milliliters. Then the other term here, you might guess, ESV is end systolic volume. Again, systole is contraction. So when a ventricle contracts, it squeezes out blood, but the ventricle typically isn't completely empty when it's done contracting. There's some residue in there. That's what end systolic volume is. This means after the ventricle is done contracting, it's ejected all the blood that it possibly can. How much is left in it? And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that is about 70 milliliters. To get stroke volume, you just subtract what you start with from the residue that's left. That's where I was getting my 70 milliliters for stroke volume. The reason I mention this, end diastolic volume, you want to think of that really as filling. If you put more blood in, they often refer to this as preload or venous return. If you put more blood in the ventricle, you're going to increase the end diastolic volume. But because of Starling's law, these are linked. If this number gets bigger, guess what happens to this number? It gets smaller. If you fill it up more, of course it's got a bigger volume, but when it contracts, it's going to contract with more force. When it contracts with more force, there'll be less left in it. So you might go from 150 to 50. And now your stroke volume is 100. So that's kind of the effect of Starling's law of the heart. You're messing with this stroke volume. If you fill it more, not only does it have more to start with, but it contracts with more force, it's going to eject more out. All right, let's see what else I want to do to you today. We'll get there. We won't do that yet. Won't do that yet. So let me go. Oh, that's good. All right, let me do one last thing of the day. I want to look at just one more bit of the valves. Now, what I'm going to do for this, let's say we'll look at this is going to be E left. Oh, by the way, about those blood pressures, pulmonary, systemic. That's why clinically we worry about systemic blood pressure. That's the one that you should concern. Pulmonary blood pressures are so low, normally you don't even worry about them. You don't measure them, you ignore them. Now, there can be issues with pulmonary blood pressure, but it's so unusual that whatever, they don't screen pulmonary pressures. They do systemic. Because again, that's where the problems are usually going to arise. All right, I'm just looking at a poor drawing on the left side of your arm. Left atrial, left ventricle. That's the bicuspid valve between the left atrial, left ventricle, and that's the aortic centrifugal valve between the ventricle and the aorta. And I just have a quick question here. If I went in and I put in some pressure monitoring devices, so I put one right here, I put one right here, and I put one right here. So then I have atrial pressure, let's say it equals 8 millimeters of mercury. That's A. Then I take ventricular pressure, I measure it, and let's say it's 42 millimeters of mercury. That's B. And then I take aortic pressure, and let's say that's 85 millimeters of mercury. So I measure the pressure in an instant in time in the atria, in the ventricle, and in the aorta. These are the pressures I measured. With that information, can you tell me what the valves are doing? That is, open or closed are your options here. So is the bicuspid valve open or closed? Semilunar valve open or closed? Just with that information. This valve here, the bicuspid, between the atrium and the ventricle, would that be open or closed under these conditions? Closed. Closed. All you have to do, remember, these valves are like a door. The pressure at B is 42 millimeters of mercury. The pressure up in the atria is 8. What direction is the blood going to try and go? 42 to 8 goes from high pressure to low pressure. What's that going to make the valves do? Close. That's what they're made to prevent. Then over here you got 40, so that'll close for sure. Then you got 42 here. In the aorta, it's 85. So what direction is the blood going to try and go? From the aorta into the ventricle. And what's that going to do to the aortic valve? Make it slam shut. That's what it's supposed to do. So it would be close. How about if I change the aortic pressure to 5 millimeters of mercury? Now what do you got? Bicuspid valve open or closed? Open, right? Because it's higher here than here. Blood's going to try and go this way, and of course that will allow the valves to open. Semilunar is 5 versus 85. No change there. It'll be closed. So you change this to open. Right? Make sense? How about let's do one last one. If I change the ventricular pressure to 116, now what's what? Bicuspid valve definitely closed. Pressure's high here, blood's going to try to go down, it'll shut the valve. How about this aortic valve? It's going to be open because pressure pushes blood out that way, that pushes the cuspid open. So it'll be closed. Open. These valves simply open or close depending on the pressure on the two sides. You can do this pretty easy, right? Nod your head. Does it make sense? Should be pretty easy. If I give you a pressure here and here, you know how that valve can open if it goes this way. If it goes that way, it don't closes. So really, any two pressures I give you here, you'll tell me if that bicuspid valve would be open or closed, right? Same with the aortic valve between the ventricle and the aorta. Be those two pressures, you can tell me if they're open or closed, right? That shouldn't be too bad. So let's take my next diagram because it looks ugly, but it's just this. Like I said, this looks, what the heck? It's exactly what we just did. What I did was give you pressures at a particular moment in time. This is just imagine you have those pressure monitoring devices, and you're just measuring the pressure in the atria, the ventricle, and aorta constantly through a couple of heartbeats. That's what this is, 2 heartbeats. What you're seeing here, this black line at the bottom, that is the pressure in the atria. Over 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. This black line at the top, that's the pressure in the aorta. Heartbeat, heartbeat. And then the big amplitude blue line here, that is the pressure in the left ventricle during 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. So all you have to do is pick a point. And you can put the pressures are over here. So at this point right here, pressure in the atria is really low, maybe 2. Pressure in the aorta is really high. Ventricle is really high. Pressure in the aorta is a little lower. I mean, at that point, give or take, I'll hash that a little bit. All right, this is the atrial pressure, pretty low. Ventricular pressure in blue, the highest of the 3, so I'll put 120. And the pressure in the aorta, it's a little lower. Agreed? So looking at this, the pressure in the atria is much lower than it is in the ventricle. That must mean the bicuspid valve is closed, right? But the pressure in the ventricle is higher than it is in the aorta. The aortic cylinder valve should be open, right? It's all this, just over time. There's a couple interesting things to note. It's all labeled at this point, so. Right here, this point here, this is when the ventricle starts to contract. As soon as that ventricular pressure gets above that atrial pressure, notice that's when they mark, that's when that bicuspid or mitral valve closes. It will stay closed until the pressure in the ventricle drops below the pressure in the atria, that's where they open. So the bicuspid valve is closed from that period of time, that period of time. Of course, x-axis is time here. And then if you look at the semilunar valve, pressure in the ventricle is lower than the aorta, lower. At this point right here where they cross, Now the pressure in the ventricle is higher than it is in the aorta. The aortic valve's open. And the aortic valves will stay open as long as that pressure in the ventricle is higher than it is in the aorta. But you drop below it right here, that's when the aortic valve's shut. Couple things to note, because you can get a question occasionally that's poor and wrong. You'll see in some of the test banks sometimes too. What if I told you something like, during ventricular systole? During ventricular systole. During ventricular systole, are the aortic valves open or closed? The answer is yes. Right. It's a bad question. You can oversimplify it too much, and that's what we'll do sometimes. Ventricular systole starts at this dark line right here. This is ventricular systole. So the ventricle starts to contract, starts to contract, starts to contract. Now, at this point, is the ventricle in systole? Yes. Are the semilunar valves open or closed? They are still closed. They are still closed. They are still closed. They are still closed. Now the heart's still in systole at this point, but the semilunar valves are now open. You gotta watch. There's actually a period of time they've indicated on this diagram from that solid line, that dashed line, what they're calling isovolumetric contraction. Isovolumetric means same volume. The ventricle is contracting, the volume isn't changing, even though it's systole. The ventricles are upping the pressure, but they will not eject any blood until the pressure exceeds what it is in the aorta. So this period of time is actually, that's what they call isovolumetric contraction. All the valves are shut at this point. From here to here, AV valves are shut, bicuspid valves are shut, but the heart is in systole. In fact, if you look at this red line down here, I don't do much with it. This is ventricular volume. You'll notice right there, that's a flat horizontal line. There's nothing leaving or entering the ventricle at that point. All valves are shut. So you gotta be a little careful oversimplifying that. You got sort of a similar thing here. This is diastole. The heart, the ventricle is now relaxing, and the pressure is dropped below the aorta, but this is still diastole, but the bicuspid valve, or mitral valve, is still closed. That action period from there to there, that's isovolumetric relaxation. All the valves are shut, even though the ventricle's in diastole. So it's not really a diastole-systole thing that determines when the valve's open and shut. It's what the pressure is on either side of the valve. That can vary over time.